Bosch, and many thanks to everyone who has attended this panel. This is really something more than a panel, it's something more of a summit, because I think as you'll see, we have some very lively scholars and practitioners who are doing great things in the realm of Kurdish translation. But I really need to begin by thanking the Kurdish Political Studies program at UCF for sponsoring this event, for hosting this event. It's really wonderful when you have a political program that recognizes polity in the broadest sense of the word. And I think that's what we're doing in practice here today. So my thanks to the Kurdish Political Studies program. That program is really a unique one, a very forward-thinking program that we have at UCF. It's housed in UCF School of Politics, Security, and International Affairs, but it draws upon expertise across the disciplines represented at UCF. So we have people with Kurdish studies interests in the philosophy department, in modern languages, as you'll hear, and really across the university. So that makes the program even stronger. And it was a program that was founded officially in October 2015 after a long, substantial gestation. And we're privileged to have with us the Jalal Talabani Chair of Kurdish Political Studies, Dr. Gunesh Murat Teskur, who's with us today and leading that program very capably. So this panel is being called Old Fire in New Words for the Kurdish New Year, Poetry and Translation. We're just coming to the end of the week of celebrating Nowruz. It officially began, well, it would have been last Saturday with the spring equinox, when the day and the night are of equal duration, and officially spring is arriving. But as you'll know, in Iraqi Kurdistan, the entire week leading up to today has been set aside to celebrate Nowruz. And Nowruz, being the Kurdish New Year, it's connected to that reverence for regeneration, for revitalization, often symbolized with fire, representing purification, goodness. And so we were thinking about this metaphor of fire, symbolizing that range of human experience, and thinking about too how we can talk about translation and practice translation in a way that taps in to some of those ancient emotions and experiences and converts them into, in this case, English, which is what we're focusing on today, but converts it to English in a way that maintains that vitality. If you've never had the chance to visit Iraqi Kurdistan, I'd recommend you go at this time of the year, because the countryside is just a patchwork of all the shades of green that one can imagine. And that, coupled with the bonfires, torches, and oil lamps for Nowruz, is really a spectacle. And one of the best ways to recognize that oncoming season of light and warmth. So light and warmth, this will be a panel focusing on enlightening insights from our panelists, and I'll introduce them in a moment. Let me just briefly, I should also importantly note, we were going to have the privilege of Dr. Nahro Zagros with us today. He was going to provide some commentary on Nowruz songs and music at the beginning and the end of the event. And regrettably, Kak Nahro has been having a very long struggle with COVID-19, so ill health has simply prevented him from being with us today, and our best wishes go out to him for a speedy recovery. Let me just go over the basic contours of the program. We're going to hear from our two panelists, Marie Labros and David Shook, and then just at the end of David Shook's talk, he's going to present a brief film, a poetic translation in moving images. And that's a translation of Zedan Khalif, who's also with us, a translation of one of his poems. And then we will have a time of brief poetry readings in both languages, followed by discussion, question, and answer. So with that in mind, I'd like to ask everyone to keep your questions and discussion points in mind as we go along. You might note them in the chat so we can all see them, and then we'll come back to them during that time of discussion. So I hope that this format works well. So first, let me introduce Dr. Marie Labros, who is the founding director of Kashkul and also the founding chair of the English department at American University of Iraq, Suleimani. Dr. LaBrosse has a number of relevant degrees. She did her BA and MED in English, teaching of English at University of Virginia, and went on to do her doctorate at the University of Exeter and her MFA as well. So someone who's well adept at working with words across languages. And that has equipped her to work in Iraqi Kurdistan since 2011. Most notably then, she set up this Kashkul, which is a center for arts and culture, a very public-facing center for arts and culture, importantly, at the American University of Iraq, Suleimani. And that is the center that has really done a lot in recent years for translating Kurdish culture, broadly defined, to a wider public audience. So Marie's talk is 2 centuries of the erotic in Kurdish poetry, and we'll go right to Marie now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tyler, for that introduction. Baini tanbash, shawari tanbash, lahar shwenakan. Amkat tanbash, amade wani variz. خوشحالم که امرو لخدمتتان باسی دو ساده لإروتیسیزم لخندراوی کردی یکم. استش اگر اسایبه ایکم به انگلیزی. Good morning, good evening, everyone, wherever you are. I'm so happy to be here with you today. Thank you, Dr. Tyler and Dr. Khazri, for inviting me here today. And thank you to the Kurdish Political Studies Program and Dr. Gunesh Teshkur for sponsoring the event. It's an honor to share the space with Mix David Shook. As David knows, at Kashkul, we work as a collaborative. There is a vibrant community behind the translations I'll share today, forthcoming in an anthology from Phoneme Media at Deep Vellum in 2023. I'd like to thank Shene Mohammed, Savan Abdul Rahman, Surusht Barzan, and Mohammed Fateh for the translation they contributed. I'd also like to thank Halo Fariq, a talented translator who is not a formal Kashkuler, but certainly, as we like to say, Ahli Dil, and my collaborator on the Sherko Bekas translations I'll include. Finally, much gratitude to Mohammed Fateh and Jiar Omer for their work as second readers and editors. Of the translations I'll share today, only Hero Kurda's words are my own translations, part of a book I'm completing this year, bringing her Danusam Yusuf, or I Write Yusuf, into English. Untangling the erotic, what excites sexual desire, from the obscene, or even more the pornographic, is always difficult, no matter the cultural context. The erotic, the obscene, and the pornographic, the three seem to form one great knot. To untie the thread from the knot, we touch all three, and all 3 strands are weighed down with prohibitions, judgments, preconceptions, and moralizing. In the Middle Eastern context, where definitions of the erotic are closely tied with definitions of the private, the secluded, or aurat, and the legacies of colonialism include the transformation of the homosocial into the perverse, the knot seems almost impossible to approach, let alone untie. So we leave these poems be. We give up untying the knot. We toss the whole mess onto the scrap heap and call it all curse poetry. And that label is deadening. No one can study it without becoming sensational. Certainly no woman can study it without, as Hero Kurda, a contemporary Kurdish poet, says, becoming some kind of porn star. And so the poems languish, as does our imagination. But poets approach readers and scholars must, and poets throughout Kurdish literary history, from the inception of the Sorani dialect as a literary language in the last decades of the Baban Principality to the contemporary moment, approach the erotic over and over again. If we reject the easy and encompassing label of curse poetry, as well as the easy and reductive discomfort of reading it, what will we find? What are they doing and why, these poets who turn to the erotic, to the forbidden, to the obscene? Let's turn to Kurdi's There from Sawa Spring. I'll read the translation in its entirety. There, from Sawa Spring, a bouquet of girls descends, one by one, cranes and geese, a flock arrayed in lines. Hair on parade, coiled over each tight breast, snakes over the treasures of gold and silver they guard. A harvest of girls come to blind my eyes, but my slim fawn isn't among them. These beauties, what are they to me? My beauty isn't among them. Yes, they bring no peace to these unsettled insides. I am murdered, captive, melancholy over my love. The proverb carved in stone, your one heart isn't 1,000. God, I'm lonely. Today is a black day. I wonder who stood in the way, or does my love spurn me? God forbid, is he sick? What has happened to him? Has my rival plucked my singular flower from this bouquet? The sharp step of my sight burns with distance from my love. Mouths run with blame like the waters of Sajnar. Qadir is Qadir. With my glance, I worship my Qadir. So Kurdi will never escape this trap. Here, Kurdi, one of the 3 pillars of the Babans, observes a group of girls descending from the spring. The poet surveys these anonymous, forgettably beautiful girls, only to remark, my slim fawn isn't among them. He is tortured. He wonders what has kept his love from meeting him, illness, a rival, boredom. Then in the penultimate line, the poet does something masterful. Qadir is Qadir, with my glance I worship my Qadir. Qadir is a word of several meanings. It is a man's name, and Kurdi, we know, knew 2 men by this name. One he knew personally, his nephew, and another he knew theologically, Sheikh Abdul Qadir Gilani, also known as the Great Helper, who founded the Qadri order in the 11th century. Qadir is also an adjective meaning able or capable that Islam uses as a synonym for God, in some ways corollary to omnipotent. So, as Kurdi concludes the poem looking for his beloved, he leaves the reader an exquisite puzzle. His final line could be elevating a corporeal beloved into the divine, a common trope of early 19th century Kurdish poetry, especially as each of these poets, however transgressive they may seem to us, were raised in hujras, trained in tekyas and khanaqas, and spent their early years as faqihs and murids, many becoming mullahs. Kurdi could also mean to dedicate himself to the founder of the Qadri order, another common practice, to commit yourself as a disciple to your teacher, an almost saintly figure. Kurdi could also mean this last line as an intricate way to praise God or Sheikh Abdul Qadir Gilani. All of these readings are possible in the line as Kurdi constructed it. And with a poet of Kurdi's deftness, I have to believe he intended the line to have a multiplicity of interpretation. The most important element of the line is its obsessive repetition of the name Qadir. Kurdi is caught. He cannot stop looking everywhere for his beloved, whether that is a corporeal or divine beloved, he cannot stop failing to find him. So the poem ends, Kurdi will never escape this trap. Whatever trap Kurdi stumbled into in love, he built intentionally into his poem. Quite literally in line 17, Kurdi cannot escape Qadir. He writes a line in which Qadir is everywhere and can be anything. That line demonstrates the allness of Qadir and demonstrates too how deeply the trap has set. This poem could be considered erotic. Kurdi, with tenderness and specificity, helps us imagine these beautiful girls descending from the spring. With grace, he extols his own misery and uncertainty as he waits for his beloved. More immediately, for many contemporary readers, this poem falls under the category of curse poem for what they designate as homosexual content. Before we agree to that categorization, let's examine the premises behind it. First, Kurdish literature simply defies any idea of definitive, be that a definitive text or a definitive interpretation of text. A single poem published today may have a handful of variants. Let's take as our example Shahraza Talabani's The Day of Sunday. Here is a poem that has significant variation between editions available today. The poem, a story in which the narrator seduces a Bulgarian male prostitute, fully intending not to tender payment come morning, has 3 divergent versions I have found. Version 1 ends with the townspeople's injunction for the narrator to pay the prostitute. Version 2 ends 6 couplets later after inexplicably praising Ahmed Pasha Baban. Version 3 ends after the same praise, but with an additional couplet of critically connective tissue that links the paying of the prostitute to the praise. Ahmed Pasha Baban was the source of the payment demanded. All these contemporary published versions of the poem have equal claim to legitimacy in that much, if not all, of Shahraza's own handwritten work has been lost or destroyed. The surviving manuscripts can claim authority through age or the scribe who wrote them down, but cannot ever claim to definitively represent the poet's intent. This challenge repeats in varying degrees with all contemporary published versions of poetry from this time period. As the versions proliferate, the poem changes, and importantly for our purposes today, as we discuss old fire in new words, the translation must change as well. Given the explosive content of the poem, the range of analysis is essential to note. Yes, it could articulate same-sex desires, but the poem could also be a particularly memorable and entirely false setup to praise a regionally powerful man. As Dr. Ferengiz Khadiri notes in her article, the challenges of writing Kurdish literary history are sizable. As Dr. Ferengiz Khadiri notes in her article, the challenges of writing Kurdish literary history, there are sizable unpublished or lost manuscripts, leaving contemporary scholars with a fragmented and episodic picture of Kurdish literary history. I have written and spoken at length about this elsewhere, but it's worth noting here, this lack of definitive text does not indicate carelessness or dispassion from Kurds toward their own culture. Rather, the opposite. The texts that remain to us today demonstrate a fierce commitment to preserving Kurdish culture in the face of overwhelming, violent, and organized persecution. Khadiri goes on to describe issues of reliability, poor editing, unclear authorship, and cautions us, rightly so, that whatever our current understanding is, it will change with future discoveries. I agree and suggest we go further, that we interrogate the necessity of definitive itself. The uncertainty we inherit around each text places limits on certain modes of analysis, but can also excite scholarship and translation alike. Readers, scholars, and translators cannot know a poet's intentions. Each act of reading is a vital act of creation. The reader, the scholar, and the translator can live beyond the definitive, accepting the fundamental principle of interpretation. Returning to Kurdi's Qadr, all this means we cannot settle on a singular reading for the poem. We do not have the information necessary to state definitively that any one interpretation is correct. That may horrify some scholars, but I think it might delight the poet. Beyond the difficulty of definitive, we encounter the limitations of language when we try to speak about the male-male intimacy of this poem. Like so many others of its time, it displays an intimacy that coexisted with Islam. The term homosexual is, as Khalid el-Ra'ayab notes, unhelpful. It is anachronistic, and when interacting with Islamic law, perilously imprecise, failing to delineate what the law condemns, which is liwat, anal intercourse between men, from what the law permits, which are expressions of love between men. Afsana Najmabadi and Catherine Babayan, introducing their edited volume Islamicate Sexualities, acknowledge that the phrase same-sex practices and desires has attempted to undo some of the cultural burdens of homosexuality, but then complicate that. Given traditional Islamicate ontologies, they continue, which specified one same essence for both man and woman, though the latter had admittedly been an imperfect version of the former, one could argue all sexual practices were same-sex practices, some just more perfect than others. They go so far as to argue that binary gender itself, applied historically, is anachronistic. Najmabadi offers a story. A slave girl was shown to an Abbasid caliph. He asked her, "Are you a virgin or what?" She replied, "Or what, O Emir of the believers?" He laughed and bought her. The girl's response to the caliph so captivates Najmabadi because it is a refusal of definite description, a refusal that Najmabadi finds useful and that perhaps Al-Ru'ayab would call helpful. The atmosphere Najmabadi, Babayan, Al-Ru'ayab, and I are trying to describe here is an atmosphere European colonialism disrupted. Throughout the 19th century, colonialism introduced Victorian morality with its ideas of sexual perversion, a term not even coined in Arabic until 1999. Rejecting definite binary language of gender and sexuality begins to push back against one more insidious legacy of colonialism. That rejection also propels us forward into finding language for an understanding of what Kurdi expresses, which is love. What would it do for Kurdish literary scholarship, for Kurdish readers more broadly, if the erotic were not a subgenre to the obscene, but situated within discourses of love? Rejecting the binary comes at a unique cost for translators for Sorani Kurdish into English. In our translations of these 19th century Kurdish poets, we confront the fact that English forces gender into what was for Kurdish a naturally genderless space. Pronouns, perhaps surprisingly, constitute the most consistently uncertain decisions my co-translators and I make. The genderlessness of pronouns in Sorani Kurdish allows devotional poetry to play with the metaphor of corporeal beloved as the divine, to transcend any gendered articulation of what corporeal form that divine beloved takes. But most descriptions of or conversations with the divine resist easy assignations of male or female. In English, each of the three gender-neutral pronouns we currently have raises its own issue. It carries highly objective connotations for such a nominative idea as God. They, while slowly becoming accepted as a singular gender-neutral pronoun in English, is immediately offensive to the vast majority of Muslim readers who would reject any implication, however vague, of God as anything but singular. Jim is such new nomenclature that it would produce fascinating translations that would also be entirely anachronistic and unreadable to those unfamiliar with contemporary queer theory. Though my co-translators and I have not yet tried, we could co-opt Derrida's representation through erasure to experiment with pronouns in our own translation, or even lean into our own dreams of producing what we call dissenting translations. Let's turn to Nali, a contemporary of Kurdi. Nali's relationship to the erotic is subtle. The least subtle example of all his subtlety is the poem he writes for Mastura, a poet herself, as well as the second wife of Khusraw Khan, the last prince of the Ardalans. For its euphemism, Dr. Marif Hasnadar, a leading intellectual in the field of Kurdish literary studies who wrote at the beginning of the 20th century, rescues this specific poem from the scrap heap of cursed poetry. Dr. Paul Sprackman, a scholar of Persian literature, describes obscenity as expressed in the simple formula, revealing what cannot be revealed. What cannot be revealed differs for men and women between sects and individual practitioners of Islam across ethnicities because the basic concept comes directly from Quranic verses, and while the divine word remains the same, human understanding of it constantly evolves. For most, the private space, aurat, of the man's body extends from the navel to the knees, and of the woman's body excludes only the face and the hands as far as the wrists. For some, a woman's aurat, what should remain veiled, includes her entire self, even her voice. Profanity begins where what should remain covered and hidden is made open and public. The greater degree of euphemism employed, the more polite, respectful, and civil the language. Conversely, the more direct the language, the more obscene it is considered. This leads to a common conflation. The less explicit, the less obscene, the less erotic. But in its cascading euphemisms, is Nali's mastura not obscene, not erotic? And whether it is obscene or erotic, why does Nali turn to these euphemisms in this poem? We have translated the poem fully, but its length precludes the full reading here. I'll summarize. Mastura comes to Nali in a dream and tempts him to solve a riddle no one else can. What is the riddle? Dream Mastura lists metaphor after metaphor. This secret, this riddle, she says, what is it? The spring of shame or survival? The majestic dome of domes yet to cave? A curtained tent that stands on two poles, at the apex a thin gossamer slit? A Sufi testing his mettle, sliding into his sanctum, sheltered, honest, sublime above? Or the silver of a miser, far from generous, shut tight with thrift, like the fists of mullahs? An overturned wine glass, such waves of soft crystal it is chipped? On and on Mastura goes, phrasing her question in the most sheer of metaphors, almost speaking what must not be spoken, until Nali takes on his own voice once more to answer her. The one for this puzzle must be a brutal specialist of strong build who can wound to the bone, who is firm and tough as the arduous books of the wise, who can hide away any study of this secret. He must be fine velvet and prolific as scholars in their prose, long and rising as the hands of prayer. And on he goes, describing the one who can answer the riddle in the sheerest of similes, until the poet interrupts himself to command himself, Nali, come on, dedicate your thoughts and dreams to God's secret paths, not the search for pleasure. Don't be the flag that flaps and desires wind. Nali cleverly protects himself in his construction of the illicit articulation, which all comes not even from Mastura herself, but a dream version of the woman. And he protects himself again with the poem's conclusion, in which the poet sharply commands himself, after over 90 lines, to stop being the flag that flaps and desires wind. Had Nali truly meant or felt the rebuke, the poem would either have been significantly shorter or would never have been written. The curse is, as Frederick Lagrange succinctly states in his contribution to Islamic sexualities, a denunciation that always remains an enunciation, simultaneous inscription and erasure. Nali waits so long to interrupt the euphemistic, erotic, insulting reverie, one can only imagine he finds satisfaction in both the offense and its censure. But this poem can also be read as a cunningly designed tool of statecraft. Nali, a court poet of the Babans, one of the three poets we know as the three pillars of the Babans, could have used the erotic against Mastura to provoke her husband and his princely family, the Ardalans, fellow Kurds, but enemies of the Babans. So then, what is the poem? Erotic? Political? A curse poem? Or Najmabadi's inclusive, or what? Let's turn now to Shahraza Talabani, the inevitable poet in a discussion of the erotic, obscene, and pornographic. Here is where the label curse poetry is actually descriptive, though so confidently applied to Shahraza Talabani's work, it's worth examining. The history of the curse poem in Arabic and Persian is long, dating back to pre-Islamic times, when people thought poetry had physical impact. Words shaped well could cause illness and death for enemies, or bring health and wealth for loved ones. Genre developed according to use, the ode, staish, and the curse, haju. Meter and rhyme were not tools of artistic effect, but of spellcasting, incantation, charm, what G.J. Van Gelder calls a form of magical warfare. As feudalism became the governing structure, princes harnessed the power that families and tribes had already perceived in or given to poetry. Poets, princes saw, had not only social but financial and military value. From approximately the 10th century onward, in areas that today comprise Iran, the material welfare of a large number of the poets devolved upon the court, which in its turn needed and employed them for purposes of propaganda. Poetry as propaganda worked so well as a tactic that one sultan introduced the office of King of Poets. Equivalent to the national and local poets laureate, the King of Poets professionalized and organized the court's poets. The system was effective. The number of poets at court swelled to over 400. The profession became so steady over the next handful of centuries that court poet became a means of subsistence, a fallback career, as in, if you can't make it as a farmer, don't worry, you can always become a poet. The political system generated a financial structure under which verse proliferated, but also stagnated. Any writing outside praise and curse had no value to the prince. With the fall of the last of the two Kurdish principalities, the Ardalans and the Babans, the last two Kurdish courts that could sustain Kurdish poets writing in Kurdish, much changed. Dates vary, but between 1840 and 1860, the Ardalans had been defeated and the Babans suborned as part of the Ottoman machinery, rusted as it was. Shahraza, a child when the Babans fell, remembers them as the height of sophistication, artistry, and Kurdish prowess. He mourns their fall and the resulting absence of a court that could welcome him in his mother tongue. For short periods of time, he attempts to serve both Ottoman Sultan and Persian Shah, but neither work out. In the end, the only prince he can find is himself. So Shahraza plays out the courtly forms of Staish and Hedju, praising and cursing not his prince's friends and enemies, but his own. He transforms what was a public, courtly form into an intimate, almost confessional form. One of Shahraza's least confessional, most courtly curse poems is Last Night for a Vital Expulsion. Last night for a vital expulsion, I visited the Khafur bathhouse. A smooth-faced boy stood there, ass and calves of crystal. Instantly, as if an engineer, my eyes measured him from the crown of his head to the tips of his toes. Like a wolf salivates over the fat-tailed sheep, desire-hungry, I grabbed an ass cheek with my eyes, I held him in my mind. So the curtain, barrier to longing, blazed and tore. I sprang as if mad to follow him to his room. The narrative arc is clear. A man meets a man in a bathhouse, feels attraction to him, and follows him home. That vital expulsion could euphemistically reference the need for the toilet in the night, but also could imply ejaculation. Whatever the expulsion, the narrator's designs are obviously sexual as he follows the smooth-faced boy home. We understood each other, the narrator says, the chance the toilet gave. I pounded, I gave, and I took until I put poison in him. The narrative seems straightforward. A story of an older man's sexual conquest of a younger man. As strong as that possibility presents itself, there is another of equal weight. In the 5th and 6th couplets, the narrator and the boy have presumably reached the privacy of the boy's room. At this point, the boy says, I'm from Sinna and beloved. It is only at that point, when the narrator knows he is about to penetrate a beloved citizen of Senandaj, that the narrator achieves erection. It rose, constant, a colossal column. Here, as throughout invective's long history, the critical aspect of sexual categories is not gender, but role. Whether one is the active penetrative participant or the passive receiving participant in the sexual relationship. These poems move in what Al-Qasim terms anal economies, privileging not the object of penetration, but the privilege and power of penetration. The insult, if we presume some narrator-poet conflation, men from Sinna are women for men of Shahrazur. The Ardalans are women compared to the Babans. In the final couplet, Shahraza praises the leader and descendants of the town, praying that they always be plentiful and protected. This line has deep ironic potential. Is it an honest good wish the poet harbors for the town that could produce such a succulent sexual partner? Or is it a double-tongued insult to the town that could produce such young men willing to submit sexually to the real men of Shahrazur? Khaznadar, as others before and after him, considers these poems of Shahraza's curse poetry not for their invective intent, which seems the more direct definition, but because they, in his words, mix the private parts of men and women and discuss homoeroticism. In Kurdish society, Khaznadar continues, if you even accuse anyone of homoerotic behavior, he will be seen as debased until his death. I don't disagree about the power of the label homoerotic in Kurdish society, but as discussed above, the word homosexual doesn't begin to describe the content of Shahraza's poetry. And who would have loved Najmabadi's slave girl more than Shahraza? She could be a character from one of his chwarina. What are you, girl, a virgin or what? Or what, ya Shekhi Shati? What are you, Shahraza? A man, a mad mullah, a poet, or what? Even our concepts of love may not be inclusive enough. When we read a poem like the one Kurdi wrote for Qadr, we cannot imagine that kind of devotion and longing existing in the realm of friendship. That mode of expression between friends feels to a contemporary register hyperbolic. But pick up the correspondence between Nali and Salam, Salam and Kurdi, read Shahraza's beautiful praise poems for Kak Ahmedi Sheikh. There is a discourse of male intimacy at work. These poets we admire, these poets who help define Kurdishness, were interested in, I won't say unafraid of, what the erotic could do. They did live in the ambiguous space between the erotic and the obscene, even the pornographic, and they were interested in the fullest reaches of love. Poets such as these will always be relevant, even as Kurdistan's modern and contemporary poets carry their work forward, exploring the erotic. The poets we have focused on today witnessed the fall of Kurdish governance. Today's established Sorani poets, Abdullah Pasho, Kajal Ahmed, Sherko Bekas, to name a few, grew up alongside the rise of Kurdish governance, the political parties of the Kurdish regional government. What is now the state was once a Kurdish guerrilla force in which these poets served shoulder to shoulder with future political leaders. Both poet and politician survived on bright ideals. As time passed, poets began to articulate the collision between revolution and governing. Criticizing a Kurdish state for which one fought is not only delicate, but heartbreaking. More, the two traditionally significant parties have financially backed their preferred poets, much like their distant princely predecessors, further complicating an artist's ability or desire to find fault. And yet, the poets speak. Sherko Bekas offers perhaps the most radical breaking point in 2011 with the release of his book-length poem, Now a Girl is My Homeland. He dedicates the first half of the book to detailing his disappointment in the Kurdish state for which he fought. Tonight, in my dream, the homeland became a huge loaf of bread. I was hungry, hungry. When I went to cut a slice, the bread became dough and dough became flour. And from the flour, in line upon line, mites and weevils marched out. The mites and weevils are an army marching, but they are not comrades or brothers. They are an infestation. The poet imagined the homeland would give sustenance and found it instead rotted. His response, part exhaustion, part self-preservation, is to make a fundamental shift. The land is no longer his beloved is his land. The woman, like his land, has geography, rivers, shores, waterfalls, and weirs. She shelters and sustains him. In Bekas's 1997 Erotica, written 15 years before Now a Girl Is My Homeland, Bekas sees his lover on the bed, as if for the first time, and in his description, we see a homeland and its emerging patriot taking shape. You make one of your legs a pyramid. A pair of white partridges are in shadow. The brief marsh is dew-covered, yet below the belly button is in full sun. On your shore I sit, half naked, and in me flame has caught the body. Now I am completely, completely naked. And wonderfully, poetry never rests. Rising generations now writing in Sorani have their own impact to make. Most notably, Hero Kurda, a contemporary Kurdish poet writing in the contested Iraqi city of Kirkuk, who writes within poetry to adore her own body, an intimate territory that has been in itself a contested space throughout the rise and fall of Saddam Hussein, the appearance of the American military in 2003, the strengthening of Al-Qaeda, and the temporary but violent dominance of the Islamic State. To Hero, understanding the erotic is first about understanding the self in relation, the body, which we think we know, but don't, and the bodies of others, which we imagine and never know as well as we wish. The erotic is an exercise in empathy. In an address she gave as a visiting artist at Kashkul in 2019, Hero maintained that eroticism may begin in desire, but desire is the first of many ways to enter a person, to suffer with them. For after all, eroticism is sorrowful. Poetry, she maintained, lets us dream between bodies. And what is that but one more way to explore the furthest reaches of love? Thank you all so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. LaBrosse. Well, you've opened up many avenues of insight and questions. That was fantastic. I wanted to remind the audience, if you would please add your questions to the chat or hold them until the end. We'll have time for questions then. I wanted to move directly to David Shook and their paper. So David is a prolific scholar, practitioner, and theorist of translation. They are a fellow of the Los Angeles Institute for the Humanities at the University of Southern California, as well as being a past artist in residence at Kashkul. Now, time doesn't permit me to even survey the range of endangered and minority languages in which David has worked. They are numerous, and that's really been an enduring hallmark of their work. In fact, I had the opportunity to attend one of David's readings a couple months ago, and one of the things that they said really stuck with me. That is that translation is advocacy, and that really characterizes what drives David's translation of poetry, as well as being an original poet in their own right. So without further ado, David's paper is called Something Missing from This World, New Currents in Contemporary Kurdish Poetry, and then we'll move directly to the short film after that. Thank you very much, David.
Thank you, Tyler, for that generous introduction, and thank you, Dr. Levinson-LaBrosse, for that intriguing paper. I have a lot of thoughts circulating in my mind now. I'd like to begin my talk today by expressing my gratitude to my many mamostakan, or teachers, the Kurdish friends and colleagues who have generously granted me access to the literatures that I'll be discussing today. So thank you, Marie, for your invitation to serve as artist in residence at Kashkul. Thank you to Zedan, in particular, for your help finding, selecting, and translating the Kurmanji language poems I'll be discussing today, and to Briar Bajalan for doing the same for the Arabic language poems. Thanks to Mairead Smith, now a PhD student at Brown, for introducing me to this cohort of young poets from Shingal in late 2018, and for her work translating their poems. And finally, thank you, Drs. Fisher and Khezri and everyone there at UCF and the Kurdish Political Studies Center for this invitation. I must confess today, first of all, that I am not a Kurdologist or Kurdish studies specialist, but rather something of a literary generalist whose interests span regions and have often focused on languages that are historically oppressed or underrepresented in English. As founder of Phoneme Media, today an imprint of nonprofit publishing house Deep Vellum, I've been fortunate to edit translations from over 30 different languages, including the first ever literary translations from languages as diverse as Uyghur, Lingala, and Ismail Zapotec. It was actually through that work that I first accessed Kurdish literature, when an exiled Kurdish phoneme reader introduced me to Dr. Levinson-LaBrosse, whose translation of Abdullah Pashot's selected poems I soon thereafter acquired and eventually published as Dictionary of Midnight in 2019. That relationship led, in the late summer of 2018, to my move to South Kurdistan, where I spent a little more than a year and a half learning more about its vibrant literatures, meeting poets and editors, and collaborating with translators. Many of those translations began in enthusiasm and my desire to be able to read and understand the poets I was meeting or hearing about. Over the course of the last 2.5 years, I've been fortunate to publish co-translations of work by 18 different Kurdish poets, writing in both the Kurmanji and Sorani variants of Kurdish, as well as Arabic. In late 2022, my co-translations of Farhad Pirbal, led by talented translator-filmmaker Pishtiwan Kamal Babakir, will be published by Deep Vellum, and my co-translations of Pirbal's work into Spanish with Giar Omer will appear from Gato Negro in Mexico City. I feel that we're entering a golden age for the translation of Kurdish literature, both contemporary and classical, into English, spearheaded by Dr. Levinson-LaBrosse and the translators that have emerged from Kashkul, including Shene Mahmoud and Giar, and by others like Drs. Khersi and Fisher and Karim Abdul-Rahman. I commonly receive messages on Instagram and Twitter from aspiring Kurdish translators from across the 4 regions of Kurdistan. English teachers working under threat of persecution in Turkey, undergraduates from Rojava, and poets across the diaspora. With so much rising talent, I feel confident that we will continue to see more and more Kurdish literature in English. And I also believe that the surge in visibility and availability will lead to a greater diversity of Kurdish voices available outside of Kurdistan. I've been encouraged by the recent publication of translations by Basir Borhani and Shirzad Alipur, presently based in Iran, and Dilan Kadir, based in Canada. While I've been grateful for the opportunity to collaborate with my several co-translators, and in some cases with the poets themselves, I'm also glad to become increasingly obsolete as Kurdish translators come to represent Kurdish poetry entirely on their own. Even so, in the present, I have endeavored not to labor in the racist and colonialist tradition of the white primary translator or legitimizing poet, relegating my collaborators to the role of what Marie has called dictionaries with legs, minimizing their contributions as those carrying the bulk of the labor and possessing the cultural and linguistic knowledge essential to the project, or further invisibilizing members of a community that has already been oppressed and marginalized for hundreds of years. In an excellent 2019 essay for the now defunct magazine In Other Words, published by the National Center for Writing in the UK, Dr. Levinson-LaBrosse put it succinctly: if we treat co-translators merely as resources, without participating in their growth and developing their abilities as translators and intellectuals in their own right, then we are practicing a subtle but violent form of intellectual and artistic racism. Now to the poetry. Today I'll be introducing the work of what I consider to be 2 strains of contemporary Kurdish poetry. One, a tight cohort of 5 poets who emerged together in the aftermath of the Islamic State's genocide of the Yazidi. The second, a looser collection of younger poets from the autonomous administration of North and East Syria, commonly known as Rojava, whose work has blossomed under the newfound freedom to write and publish in the Kurdish language. With the notable exception of the poet Jaf, the first group of poets writes primarily in Arabic. While this may, on its face, seem surprising, it makes sense when you consider the Arabization policies of the Ba'athist state, as well as the Arabic language education system that continues today in the Shingal region where these poets come from. In fact, Kurdishness itself is a complex concept, and some of the poets I will discuss today have challenged the usefulness of the very label, as well as their inclusion beneath its umbrella. Indeed, while some contemporary Yazidis consider themselves a subgroup of the Kurdish people, others identify as a separate ethno-religious group. This debate continues within the academic community as well. In this talk, I do not intend to take a position in that argument, but to present poetry being written within the broader framework of Kurdish literature. Of course, the poet's wishes are of paramount importance, and this is something I've been fortunate to be able to discuss with them. Ahmad Bashar, in particular, is someone with whom I've discussed his discomfort with being labeled a Kurdish or Yazidi poet. Like many poets around the world, he resists both tokenization and being pigeonholed by the expectations of the larger literary world, which I respect and hope to honor, even as I include his work in this discussion. While we often speak of Kurdish literature and identity as a sort of monolith, I believe that in many ways its strength and vibrance spring from its diversity. Most of the latter group I will discuss today from Rojava, write in the Kurmanji variant of Kurdish. You will hear me refer to Kurmanji as a variant rather than a dialect, and I believe that the term is more accurate in a scientific sense, based on my background in generative linguistics and language preservation. The Kurdish language, of course, is a dialect continuum comprised of at least 3 major families. Most variants are not mutually intelligible, though they do descend from the same branch of the Indo-European tree, meaning, of course, both that they are distantly related to English and that they are not at all related to the Semitic language Arabic. While I do believe that the primary variants of spoken Kurdish today are distinct enough not to qualify as dialects, I also see the cultural and political value in referring to a broader Kurdish language, which has particular value in a literary historical sense relevant to today's talk. Kurmanji is today spoken in northern Syria and Turkey, as well as in several neighboring and nearby countries, and has somewhere between 8 and 20 million speakers, according to various estimates. For the record, I suspect the true number to be somewhere around 16 million. Its written literary tradition dates to the 17th century, and it has long been a vehicle for the transmission of oral literatures, including the songs and prayers of the Yazidi. In Rojava, the language uses the Latin script. Historically, much early literature was written in the Arabo-Persian script, and among the relatively tiny population of speakers in Armenia, even Cyrillic. No Yazidi can go back. Ahmad Bashar, elder statesman of the group at 29, told me over the messaging app Viber in late 2018. It left a part of us dead inside. I try to resuscitate it with romantic shock, electric shock, the shocks of life. Useless. The Islamic State killed a part of us that can never be healed. I met these 5 poets in late 2018 when Mairead Smith wrote Dr. Levinson-LaBrosse to ask if Kashkul would be willing to put together a reading for them in Suleimani. As the organization's artist in residence, I was tasked with planning the event alongside my colleague Briar, today a PhD student at the University of Exeter. Following that successful reading, I continued to get to know the poets, who met in 2015 during their time at the University of Duhok, where they began an informal workshop critiquing and discussing each other's poems, alongside other work they had recently encountered and enjoyed. They read voraciously, trading books, and Zedan believes that their frank honesty contributed to both their mutual respect and improvement as poets. He recalls, Ahmad and I came back to Duhok from the Yazidi holy city of Lalish, where Ahmad had just given a reading. He asked how I found his poem. I said it was not good, and he asked me why. I thought it was not good. And this is how we became friends. Ahmad's long narrative poems evoke the Yazidi oral tradition with their repeated refrains and song-like verses, as in The Slave, which exemplifies that quality in its middle section, which I've exerted here. I wish I were a slave, says the matchman, lighting his last cigarette. I wish I were a slave, says a lost tourist, tossing his passport in the sea. We wish we were slaves, say the drunks at dawn, staggering their way back to life. When he reads the poem aloud, it culminates in his singing the toast that serves as the poem's grand finale. Its protagonist, an escaped slave, raising his cup in defiant survival from high on a hill. Imad, the earliest poet of the group to reach a wider literary audience, has done much to champion his peers, encouraging them personally and promoting them publicly. It's also worth noting that his poetry varies quite widely in character and tone. Some of my favorites of his recent work include his imagistic prose poems, which I don't have the time to read today. His second book, Me and You Are Alike, was published in late 2018. I want to tell how we are, how we live with shit every day, Saad Shivan wrote me over Facebook Messenger in late 2018. Saad met the others later at a 2017 reading in Baghdad. Like his peer Sarmad Salim, born in 1993, he primarily writes short lyrics punctuated with straightforward statements of fact. His work is distinct in the way that his language skates the slippery surface of memory, though the themes of memory and trauma do recur throughout the poetry of this group. In one of his untitled poems, he mimics the pauses, justifications, and clarifications of everyday speech. In my old village, I mean before the war, I repeat, the old one, we walked alongside the coffins flooding out into the streets, wrapped in blankets and not the country's flags. At the time, we didn't really have a country. Or at least we didn't feel that we did. Over the course of his short poems, Saad often employs this effect so that their speaker's voice gradually takes on greater authority before climaxing in dense charged couplets, like this one, which ends his poem, The Clock Shows 1 a.m. There are no oil wells where we were living in Shingal, but I assure you, we are rich in mass graves. The poem manages, in a mere 2 lines, to evoke the relative international economic irrelevance of his people's region, the resulting lack of political will, the name of the Yazidis' beloved mountain homeland, and the devastating reality of their mass murder at the hands of the Islamic State. Jaff, born in 1994, is the only one of these 5 poets to write primarily in Kurmanji, sometimes translating his own work into Arabic to increase its potential audience. Much of his work is set in the tent camps where the majority of Yazidis now live. He laments that a boy can no longer climb mischievously onto the roof, that simple play is distant as myth. The people that inhabit his poems often resemble ghosts. Their constant fleeing has incapacitated them from doing anything else, even in the face of romantic love. Perhaps, as his friend Saad writes in one poem, there are events that humans do not survive. They just continue to exist. Life in the camps, as depicted in poems by several of these poets, crawls by. Everything but boredom is tightly rationed. Jaff's poem Delirium begins with the view from the flap door of his cramped tent. Through the door of the tent, 7 steps between me and the street. The child who died 23 years ago. He throws his stones at the window and flees. It's unclear if the child throwing rocks is a dead child or its ghost, or a young man dead to the world, numb with the hopelessness of the camp's interminable purgatory. And indeed, does it matter? In his brief poem, Sarmad brandishes devastatingly deadpan irony to recount Yazidi tragedy. His poem about the Mediterranean drowning of a group of Yazidis bound toward Germany ends with the line, "The fish were happy." As a poet, he often looks outwards towards other literatures to contextualize what has happened to his people, who return to the, quote, habitable but sacked ruins of their homes, without seeing Godot, who waited for so long. In another poem, he receives a strange email. "Dear Sarmad, you are lonely," from the great Iraqi poet Sargon Bulos, who narrates the young poet's tragic recent past and present for him, before politely asking him to quit writing, ending with the bold discouragement, "None of us hear you." In a third poem, the speaker sachets down the streets of Shingal in high heels belonging to his displaced mother, ecstatically pronouncing her return as he embodies it. "I put on my mother's high heels, and I go out on the streets of Shingal. I tell the land that, she's back, she's back, she's back," and I fall flat on my face. Of these 5 poets, I've worked most closely with Zedan Khalif, a translator himself, and today an MFA student at San Francisco State University. Zedan is well known for publicity photos that feature his face upside down, slyly smiling in his horned rims. As with the biographical note that Jaff provides when asked, Jaff has no biography. Zedan's insistence on being represented as he wishes makes sense in the context of Yazidi erasure. In his poems, he refers with equal ease to Anne Sexton and Santa Claus, Frida Kahlo and Sasha Grey, all against the backdrop of the IDP camp, a place he endows with an imposing physicality meant to contrast with the invisibility of both the individual and collective Yazidi. His poem, "In the Camp's Kindergarten," begins, "In the camp's kindergarten, I asked each one of them to draw something missing from this world. Each one of them drew themselves." Zedan, just 25, lived in the Chamisko IDP camp on the outskirts of the town of Zaho from November 2014 until late 2019, when he moved to Suleimani to take a position at Kashkul. His poems cleverly weave together narratives of both personal and collective traumas, as well as ideas both concrete and abstract. A barcode scanner is a perfect example of that masterful loom work. The poet's permutating refrain describes the IDP camp as seen from above, a barcode of browns. Tent block, then muddy street, then tent block. With this recurrent image spanning the page-long poem, Zedan catalogs the commodification of the IDP. In the beginning, there was the number, and the number became a price tag stuck to us. The number made our selection easier from afar, no need to point. A tomato seller wishes that potential customers could learn to associate the color red with something else. A desperate IDP wanders through the camp with his ration card in his hand, extended like a mine detector. Life goes on. In Zedan's poems, IDPs surf Facebook and stream porn on their cell phones. Yazidi oral tradition balances those contemporary influences. Zedan has told me how he grew up surrounded by epic poems sung as Tiran, the Yazidis' form of social song. The community's millennium of persecution has steadily whittled away their corpus of poetry, sizable slabs of it calving into oblivion at peaks of violence. Doubtlessly, we lost many Yazidi poems because of the genocidal campaigns against the Yazidi by Muslim conquests, the Ottoman Empire, Al-Qaeda, and recently by the Islamic State, he wrote me over WhatsApp. Today, with Zedan as our leader, Marie Briard and I are editing an anthology of Yazidi poetry forthcoming from Deep Vellum. Beyond the poetry and experience of these poets from Shingal, the anthology will feature Yazidi poets writing from Rojava, Armenia, and even Germany, where Rania Atman composes her verses in German. It's my hope that the publication of this book might lead to several single author collections for an English-speaking readership. Already this year, a bilingual Arabic-English volume of Zedan's poetry is forthcoming from Kashkul Books for the Kurdish and Iraqi markets. By the time I moved to South Kurdistan in the late summer of 2018, I had been watching the development of the autonomous administration of North and East Syria for several years. Like many others, I was excited to see how its libertarian socialist government would take shape, and inspired by its publicly declared values of gender equality, environmental sustainability, and pluralism. As a poet and translator, I was eager to learn more about the region's literature, and in Zedan, I met the collaborator who would make that possible. When we began translating several poets from the region in spring 2019, we could not have imagined the severity of what would begin unfolding in October, when a phone call between Presidents Trump and Erdogan resulted in the launch of the euphemistic Operation Peace Spring, a military invasion of the territory that resulted in the murder of over 500 civilians and then in the displacement of more than 300,000. To date, we have translated selections of work by Jihan Hessan, Jiwan Nebi, Jimen Ali, Taha Khalil, and brothers Hoshman and Jiwan Kado, which have been published by outlets including Words Without Borders and Poetry London, which each ran special features, and the Los Angeles Review of Books, Plume, and Epiphany, which successfully nominated a poem by Hoshman for the annual Best Microfiction Anthology. I believe that the work by these poets offers a humanizing glimpse into a region so quickly reduced in public forums to political analysis and partisan assertions. Unsurprisingly, there does exist a more bellicose and patriotic strain of contemporary poetry from Rojava. While these poems have their place in society, they often require onerous explanation, are less grounded in imagery, and from a literary perspective, I find them frankly less compelling. The poems I will reference today do not directly address the political landscape of Rojava or the nationalist strain of pan-Kurdish literature. They do, however, reflect the passions and preoccupations of its residents, whose history of persecution over the past decades makes the very act of writing in Kurdish a defiance of repression. Much of the poetry of Jiwan Kado, who today lives in Germany, expresses a longing to return to the less complicated days of childhood, as in the latter half of this untitled poem, which begins with the dread the poet feels toward the tedious responsibilities of adulthood. My father's calloused hands were my quilt. I received a letter telling me, "You are a child." Is this an accolade or an insult? I wish I were a child and could listen to the cricket's chirp from the foreskin Mohammed severed, and could wet my bed and raise the soiled sheet as my homeland's flag. Many of Jiwan Nebi's poems appear to be set in war-torn Syria, shots ringing through abandoned cities. Only the madman has stayed behind in the city, barefoot. On cold nights, shots can be heard. What does he have to fear? He has no kin, no kingdom but the city. He'll resort to anything. He calls out to those who have abandoned the city, as if they took what's left of his mind with them, and all his cigarettes. It is worth noting that, like the madman of his poem, Nebi himself has remained in Kamishlo. Like Kado's, Jihan Hessan and Jimen Ali's poetry is a poetry of longing, whether for a lover or the homeland. Ali writes, I passed by your house. I saw a clothesline on the balcony. I searched for your clothes, but couldn't find them. Now I know the saying's true. When you love someone, you even love their dog. In fact, the two women often link the concept of a homeland to the idea of a lover, a substitutive image that recurs in the work of Sorani poets Abdullah Pashot and Bekas, as Dr. Levinson-LaBrosse has mentioned, as well as in the work of Jegar Hwain. At the same time, these poets' work engages with the poetry of the wider region, and of Greater Syria especially, where the majority of these poets pursued their tertiary education. Multilingualism is widespread in Rojava, where many speak Arabic as well as Turkish, Persian, and other variants of Kurdish, and literary translators, including Zedan, labor nobly to bring more books into Kurmanji from the languages of the world. When Jiwan Kado's first book, The Blind Snakes, came out in 2003, publishing a Kurdish language book was officially against the law in Syria, where minority populations have long endured intense legal discrimination, including arbitrary revocation of citizenship, prohibitions on property ownership, and even a ban on speaking Kurdish in their own homes. Since official publication was impossible, the popular book circulated in Samizdat, passed from reader to reader. By the time Hessan and Nebi had written their first books, Rojava had achieved its de facto autonomy, and they were able to publish their work after an end to the ban on Kurdish language publications. It's important to note that Rojava is not entirely or exclusively Kurdish. The region's diverse population is about 40% Arab and includes smaller communities of Armenians, Assyrians, Chechens, Dam, and Turkmens, among others, as well as a small but notable population of immigrants from the West. It is, however, the poets writing in Kurmanji whose work most engages with the idea of a cohesive cultural identity forged from a combination of Rojava's recent political autonomy and the unique culture its residents aspire to create. While these poets may claim multiple identities, they do consider themselves poets from Rojava. I believe that the region's emphasis on the rights and equality of women accounts for the greater gender parity among its contemporary poets, a trend I hope to see continue to grow. Today, the ambitious, idealistic, autonomous administration of North and East Syria continues to face an existential crisis. These poems, meanwhile, display the health and vitality of a literature that has already proved to be a potent medium for self-expression, a grounds for linguistic experimentation, and an important declaration of autonomy itself. Hoshman Kado's poem, Why Don't They Believe?, the last I'll read today, in part, is a potent example. They don't believe that I can't drink wine anymore. They don't believe that even carelessly I respect women. They don't believe that I cry frequently. They don't believe that my love is enough for everyone I know. They don't believe that I celebrate butterflies and that I paint a rainbow on the sky of my bedroom before I wake up. They don't believe that my body sings like a sparrow once I embrace my dreams. They don't believe that I have the memory of a fish and that I kiss everything unwittingly. They don't believe that we drape thousands of worn-seamed dresses over my homeland and that we fling the patches from our faces. They don't believe that we crushed the grapes made of wishes and that every night we drank them against the sound of darkness. They don't believe that my leaf has fallen from the tree and that the street's mouth is choked with leaves. They don't believe that freedom is my childhood toys and that those toys have been broken. They don't believe that man is a new landscape and that only love can beautify it. They don't believe that Shakiro is the king of singers and that he beckons cranes back from the sky. They don't believe that our faces can be darkened without soot and that I'm no exception in my homeland's sun. They don't believe that I only want to live. Thank you all so much. I am going to move quickly to this film for you guys, as I know I have gone a little long. Here we go.
فشارع زفت فقطاع خيم. في البدء كان الرقم، والرقم صار سعرا والتصق بنا، وسهل الرقم انتقاءنا عن بعد دون ما استعانة بالسبابة. ثم صارت الأرض مذياعا وببطارية أبدية لا يبث محطة ولا يكف عن التشويش. شارع زفت فقطاع خيم فشارع زفت. نربينا على كره الموت وحب الموتى، نربينا على حب الحياة وكره الأحياء. يغني لأحد المجنون وهو يهرب من مراهقين يحاولون نزع بيجامته عنه. قطاع خيم فشارع زفت فقطاع خيم. النازح حمار وحشي في عراء مسيج، ويتصفح منشورات مجموعة مغلقة على الفيسبوك. شارع زفت فقطاع خيم فشارع زفت. فلتبيض عيناك وتصير جثة الطاووس رقعة عين لك أيها القرصان التائه. دعاء أمهات جائعات يطبخن الملل على أبناء يشخرون في منتصف النهار في كل خيمة. قطاع خيم فشارع زفت فقطاع خيم. من يعرف النازح بشروق الشمس، من يقنعه أن للشمس أي غرض آخر غير بث الحرارة. شارع زفت فقطاع خيم فشارع زفت. الزوعة التي تدخل الخيمة وتطيرها عن رأسك ليست سوى رقصا صوفيا للحياة الزاهدة الساخرة منك. قطاع خيم فشارع زفت فقطاع خيم. مادا يده وماسكا البطاقة التموينية، هكذا يسير النازح في الشوارع بحثا مثل مستشعري ألغام. شارع زفت فقطاع خيم فشارع زفت. بائع الطماطم ليته مهرجان التراشق بالطماطم يقام هنا لمرة واحدة على الأقل، لينعم الشعب برؤية الأحمر بطريقة أخرى. قطاع خيم فشارع زفت فقطاع خيم. بائع البصل فلتحيا الحياة، بائع الباذنجان ها ها ها. قطاع خيم فشارع زفت فقطاع خيم. الحياة يأس وشفر في المخيم، والنازح ليس بهاكر. شارع زفت فقطاع خيم فشارع زفت. قطاع خيم فشارع زفت فقطاع خيم. شارع زفت فقطاع خيم فشارع زفت. عزيزي المستهلك، تعذر التعرف على البلد المنتج للحرب.
Well, thank you very much, David. And thank you, Marie. David, I think you offered us one of the most valuable things that a practitioner and a scholar can offer, and that is an overview and an update of your field. Thank you so much for that. And Zedan Khalif, thank you for being with us. The poet is with us for that multimedia translation. Let's move directly to questions and answers and discussion for this last 10 minutes. Perhaps to prime the pumps briefly, Marie, you gave us an excellent discussion of Qadr as a recurring word, name in your poem. But how does that convey or open up those various meanings to a readership that doesn't have Kurdish? Would you require footnotes or simply leave it as is, untranslated?
Yes, you know, any question you can ask about that poem, my co-translators and I have asked ourselves over and over and over again. We decided not to translate the word and to leave it with a footnote, because we really felt it was important not to decide for Kurdi or the reader what that poem meant. And any translation we could have offered of that one word would have collapsed the possible meanings in the poem and really would have put in a massive amount of our own judgment, which of course is in the translation anyway. You know, translators can't help that. That's part of a translator's job, is to figure out what their reading of the poem is. But that one line we felt was so important to keep open to interpretation for every reader. We kept the word qadr in there. What we did was we used, so it comes as the first word in the line, which automatically has a capital Q. We kept that. We italicized the second qadr and lowercased it. And then we uppercased the last qadr, so that whatever you were doing with the first and the last had it recalled something to do with the divine in its capitalization. So that was the approach that we took in that instance. In other instances, we felt that our interpretation could be one among many, but the line really only could sustain one. Others might interpret it differently, but this would be ours. In this line, we thought it was important to keep it much more open for each reader.
Thank you. I like that solution, the visual representation of different possible meanings.
I think visual representation is underutilized in translation. I also think digital publication and digital rendering of translation, where you can have what looks like a very simple plain screen, but then have rollover options. People can choose to sort of iterate the screen in a different way. I think digital publication for translation is really untapped. And I haven't found the right person to explore that with me yet, but I'm very excited about it, specifically because you could even open it up to crowdsourcing and say, leave us your rendition of how you think this line could go, which is just such a great way to encourage participation and to encourage the idea that translation is mutable, not immutable. So yeah, I think there are lots of possibilities there.
Well, that's fantastic. Far, far better than simply putting a hyperlink on Qadr, right? Questions for our panelists? There are a couple coming through the chat. Have we answered all of them, addressed them? Oh, there's one. Kamuran. Even all the difficulties we the Kurds face, I wonder what bring or force you to Kurdistan? Good question. Either one of you, David, Marie, will you take that?
Well, I think in a very real sense, it was literature that compelled me to travel to Kurdistan. And that's what I found so compelling about being there. Literature, culture, the friendships I developed, many with people within that sphere. Alana, you've spent a lot more time there and been there much longer. So I would be interested to hear your answer.
But it's the same. I moved to Kurdistan in 2011 after a lot of debate with my family, who was concerned for me, but in the end very supportive. My mom is here today, which is very special for me. And I moved to Kurdistan when, in conversation, I asked someone, what do you guys do for fun? Someone who was interviewing me at the university. And he said, well, if you like to read and spend time outdoors, this is the place for you. And I said, yep, that is the place for me. And then a few minutes later, we were talking about the city, how many hospitals it had, what the bazaar was like, things like that. And this person happened to mention that the streets were named after poets. And I was like, that's it. That's where I'm going. I want to go someplace the streets are named after poets. And And in a way, I always laugh because I had no idea how good that decision was for me. I had no idea how different the poetic cultures were between the US and Kurdistan. In the US, you host a successful reading and it's like 40 people. People are like, wow, you really must have advertised for this super well. If it's more than 10, people are very pleased. In Kurdistan, I hosted a reading for Sherko Bekas right after Now a Girl Is My Homeland came out, and traditional venues for his reading from that book had been banned. He was being kept from them. So he's very excited to find an outlet at the American University of Iraq. And I hosted this reading, about 250 people came. And I was like, wow, this is the biggest reading I've ever seen in my life. This is amazing. And Sherko was like, this is disgraceful. And I was so shocked. And it took me years to figure out that, of course, Sherko was used to people attending in their thousands. And so, 250 people to me was massive, but to Sherko was a travesty. Yeah, and it's one of my biggest pleasures in life to go to poetry readings in Kurdistan. I mean, when I went to where I met Abdullah Pesho, the first time I ever saw Pesho read, the hall was completely overcrowded, probably 3 times more than the carrying capacity of the room, which was massive. The carrying capacity was at least 500 to 700. There were at least triple that many people there. And the young men were sitting, one would sit in a chair and then one would sit on each knee. So it's 3 young men to a chair. And everyone was mouthing the words along with Pesho. And when the crowd loved a poem, they would chant dubara, dubara, which means again, 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 which again, you just can't, Kurds who've never come to the West and seen a poetry reading here the way we do it, you just can't imagine how different that is and how exciting and vital that is to see a poetic culture like that. I felt like I literally felt like an archaeologist who had discovered the next most important thing for humanity to see. And I felt thrilled that I got to be part of bringing that to global literature. It just felt like it felt like such an honor and such a privilege. So literature took me to Slimani. I had no idea that it would be such a great discovery and such a great part of my life.
That's fascinating and really speaks to translation in the broadest sense, translating entire cultures of poetry, which is what you are both doing. We have one last question in the chat from Shene, who's getting to the heart again of this issue of negotiating readings. Will either of you address this question in the chat?
Sorry, I'm just reading here, Shene.
I think Alana probably has a much more elegant answer to this question, so I'll just say a few quick words and then let her.
Let's not assume that, David.
Definitive response. But I think for me, that process of active negotiation is what makes co-translation such a valuable practice and such a special space, I think. You often hear translators say that translation is the closest form of reading. And I would actually argue that co-translation is a closer form of reading if you're doing it right, because it's 2 people or more sitting together, working through a poem, word by word, sentence by sentence, phrase by phrase, unpacking the syntax, figuring out, co-translation and the discussions that spring from it, I often feel teach me at least as much about English as they do about Kurdish. And I'm really fortunate to see a number of my co-translators here in this chat, and I can't tell you some of the rabbit holes we've gone down, looking up etymologies from both languages, or referring to a third language, or making YouTube playlists of all of the things referenced in the poems. For me, as someone who does not identify as a scholar, but as a poet and translator, I think that practice of negotiation is essential to the successful co-translation, and I think it's a great gift for me personally.
That's a beautiful answer. The only thing I might add is that, Shanae, those commentaries, as you know, as everyone knows who's dealt with these poems, are so helpful. They're, in some ways, I love the cultures that Islam gives to the literary world in the Middle East. So, of course, Islam's culture of interpretation, exegesis, it almost like copies itself into how we deal with literature. And in fact, much of the literature I talked about today from the 19th century was conceived of and written as sacred, as part of the devotional practice. So that makes a lot of sense. The commentaries are incredibly helpful, and this is something that I encourage my students into all the time in Iraq. It's so important to confront the poems as poems, especially with the 19th century poems. It's easy to get overwhelmed by how complicated they are and to be cowed by it, to sort of back gently out of the poem, assuming you do not understand what it means, and to turn to someone you trust, an established scholar, to tell you what it means. But the most vital thing readers can do is not ignoring that commentary, but really confronting the poem as a poem for themselves and deciding, seeing, exploring what that poem can mean to them as an individual. And I think one of the things that David and I both do, I've seen David do this, is use all of their background as a poet and read the poem as a poem. And sometimes, even when I don't know what the Kurdish is, even if because, as you all know, 19th century Kurdish poems have many languages within them, all dialects of Kurdish, Farsi, Turkish, Arabic, and then all the classical versions of these languages as well. So sometimes you can be reading along and you're like, oh, that line isn't in Kurdish. That word is not Kurdish. That word is Kurdified Arabic. And when I hit words like that and I don't know what they mean, sometimes it's even possible for me to sort of anticipate where the poet is going, because I feel what the poem requires. So I do think that David and my background as poets has been very helpful to us in confronting these poems anew. And I also think too, but there's a value in being a dumb outsider who doesn't know any better. I started translating Shahraza, and if I had known how complicated his poems were, if I had known the language he uses, there is no way I would have begun that. There's no way. And thank God I didn't know, because then I did start and I did try. And I always say, like, sometimes if you're just looking at your feet, you don't realize you climbed the mountain. Just keep eyes on your feet, and suddenly you're at the mountaintop. Yeah, there is some benefit to having outsiders. I mean, this is the joy of translation, is also having the world be in conversation with your poets and having a different world than the world the poems came from interact with those poems. That's part of the pleasure of translation.
I'll just add to that, which I think is a very elegant answer, that I have typically had the advantage of working with work by living poets. And in most instances, if I need to, or if we decide it's something we want to do, we can contact those poets. Of course, with a poet, when you ask them what something means, it's a crapshoot that they're going to say, I don't know, or they're going to make something new up every time. I may be guilty of that myself.
Or say,
you know,
one poet said to me, or they'll say to you, as one poet said to me, if you don't know what the line means, you shouldn't be translating the poem. And I was like, oh, okay, all right. Go ahead, David, sorry.
No, that is, I'm fortunate that hasn't happened to me much. But I think for me too, another thing that has been really exciting and really rewarding is the opportunity to engage with the poets themselves, even across languages. And sometimes, I mean, I remember one beautiful evening, actually, when we finally got the permission from AUIS to fly my drone over Chimishko to get that footage for the film, which was a very lengthy process. I mean, we were delayed almost a year. That night, we went to Imad Bashar's house, very near, almost a stone's throw from the Syrian border. And Jaf came over, and Pishtiwan Kamal, one of my collaborators and co-translators, and Zedan and I just sat around and talked in the dark courtyard of his home until we fell asleep, early in the morning. And it's those sorts of encounters and really, I think, special spaces that writers so often create and are generous enough to invite me into, that really give me life and inspire me.
Well, thank you to you both for giving us greater access to that conversation that is translation across cultures and across languages. I want to thank you on behalf of UCF, on behalf of the Kurdish Political Studies program. You will always be welcome here, whether virtually or in person, we can hope. And just to note, since we're thinking a lot about language today, UCF is excited to announce that we'll be offering Kurdish language classes next year. One of the few silver linings of the COVID-19 pandemic is that those classes will be virtual, so they'll extend to a much wider possible audience, and they will be in the capable hands of Dr. Haydar Khesri, who's with us today. So an exciting initiative in that regard, amongst many exciting initiatives across borders like you're involved in. Thanks again to the panelists. Thank you to all of you who attended in different time zones. And I'm checking at the chat. There's a few more comments. Fantastic. Thank you for your collaborations today.
Thank you so much, Tyler and Haydar, and happy Nowruz to all.
Kwa Hafiz.
No.